These two men standing before that cabin don't look like much, do they? Gaunt faces, hollow eyes, bodies worn down by years in the wild. But in the summer of 1899, these brothers terrorized the Louisiana Delta in ways that still haunt the Bayou today. They hunted women like animals, dragged them into the suffocating darkness of the swamp, and did things so unspeakable that grown men wept when they discovered the truth. The manhunt that followed became a battle between civilization and savagery, between lawmen and predators who knew every shadow, every channel, every hiding place in that godforsaken wilderness. This is the story of how evil found the perfect place to hide, and how it was finally dragged into the light. Stay until the end to hear how they were finally caught. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. In the summer of 1899, deep within the Louisiana Delta, two brothers lived in a way that defied every rule of civilized society. The bayou stretched for miles in every direction, a maze of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, with water the color of strong tea. This was a place where sunlight barely reached the ground, where the air hung thick and heavy, and where screams could echo without ever reaching another human soul. The Leblanc brothers had made this isolated wilderness their home, and for years, whispers of their existence circulated among river folk and traveling merchants. But whispers were all anyone had until women began to vanish. The Delta in those days was a lawless frontier. Towns were few and far between, connected only by treacherous waterways that twisted and turned without mercy. Travelers had no choice but to navigate these channels, often alone or in small groups. The Leblanc brothers understood this better than anyone. They had grown up in these swamps, learning every hidden channel and secret passage. Their father had been a trapper who disappeared when they were young, leaving them to raise themselves in the wild. By the time they reached adulthood, they were more animal than man, with matted hair, wild eyes, and a complete disconnect from human morality. Local legends painted them as bogeymen, creatures that existed somewhere between myth and reality. Fishermen claimed to see their crude boats moving through the fog at dawn. Trappers spoke of finding strange markers carved into trees deep in the swamp. But no one truly believed the stories, not completely. How could two men survive so far from civilization? How could they pose any real threat? The Delta was vast enough that most people assumed they would never cross paths with the brothers. They were wrong. The first disappearance that caught official attention was in May of 1899. A young woman named Marie Thibodeau had been traveling with her husband from New Orleans to visit family upriver. Their small boat had engine trouble near a section of the bayou known as Dead Cypress Bend. Her husband rowed to shore, leaving Marie alone while he searched for help. When he returned 3 hours later with a mechanic, his wife was gone. The boat sat empty, drifting slightly in the current. Her shawl lay folded neatly on the seat, as if she had placed it there intentionally. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate violence. She had simply vanished into the thick, oppressive air. Within 2 months, 3 more women disappeared under similar circumstances. Each had been traveling through remote sections of the Delta. Each had been left alone, even briefly. Each vanished without a trace, leaving behind only confusion and growing terror. The local sheriff, a man named Augustus Broussard, began to see a pattern that chilled him to his core. All the disappearances occurred within a 20-mile radius of Dead Cypress Bend, deep in the most isolated part of the swamp. And in each case, witnesses reported seeing a crude flat boat moving through the area shortly before the women went missing. The boat was always piloted by figures that seemed to melt into the landscape, barely human in their movements and appearance. Sheriff Broussard realized he was hunting something more dangerous than any criminal he had ever faced. He was hunting predators who knew every inch of their hunting ground, who had perfected their terrible craft, and who had no intention of stopping. Sheriff Broussard assembled a search party of 12 men, all experienced hunters and river guides who knew the Delta's dangers. They set out on a humid August morning, their boats loaded with supplies, weapons, and grim determination. The sheriff had spent weeks studying maps and interviewing anyone who claimed knowledge of the deepest swamp regions. One name kept appearing in these conversations, whispered with a mixture of fear and disgust. The Leblanc brothers. Old-timers remembered their father, a strange and violent man who had retreated into the wilderness after killing a man in a bar fight. His sons had been born out there, raised in complete isolation, with no schooling, no church, and no contact with civilized society. Finding their location proved extraordinarily difficult. The brothers had chosen their territory with predatory intelligence. Their camp sat on a small island of solid ground, surrounded by treacherous mudflats that could swallow a manhole. The approach required knowledge of a specific path through channels that shifted with the seasons. False routes led to dead ends, or worse, to areas where the water concealed submerged logs that could tear apart a boat's hull. The search party spent 5 days navigating these waterways, guided by a former trapper named Jacques Melanchon, who claimed to have stumbled upon the brothers' camp years earlier and barely escaped with his life. When they finally approached the island, the scene that greeted them seemed pulled from a nightmare. The brothers had constructed a ramshackle dwelling from driftwood, animal hides, and scavenged materials. Animal skulls hung from trees like grotesque ornaments. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay, smoke, and something else that the men couldn't identify but would never forget. The camp was empty when they arrived. The brothers had somehow sensed their approach and fled deeper into the swamp. But what the search party found in that camp would haunt them forever. Evidence of the brothers' crimes lay scattered throughout the area. Personal belongings that clearly belonged to women, items of clothing, and other objects that painted a horrifying picture of what had happened here. The men found a crude journal kept by one of the brothers, filled with barely legible writings that detailed their activities with disturbing casualness. They spoke of collecting women who passed through their territory, of viewing them as property, and of actions so terrible that Sheriff Broussard ordered the journal sealed as evidence, forbidding his men from reading further. The psychological impact on the search party was immediate and severe. 2 men broke down completely, unable to process what they were witnessing. Others became enraged, demanding immediate justice. But the brothers were gone, vanished into the depths of the bayou they knew better than anyone. The search party set up camp on the island, determined to wait them out. They knew the brothers would have to return eventually for their supplies and shelter. As night fell and the sounds of the swamp grew louder, the men began to understand the true nature of their quarry. These were not ordinary criminals who could be reasoned with or intimidated. The Leblanc brothers were apex predators who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of survival in this brutal environment. 3 nights passed in tense silence. The search party maintained constant watch, rotating guards throughout the darkness. The bayou came alive after sunset, filled with sounds that seemed almost human at times. Alligators bellowed in the distance. Night birds called out with eerie precision. And somewhere in that darkness, the Leblanc brothers were watching, waiting, and planning. The men felt it instinctively, that predatory presence circling their camp like wolves studying their prey. Sleep became nearly impossible. Even the most experienced hunters among them felt their nerves fraying under the psychological pressure of being watched by unseen eyes. On the fourth night, the brothers made their move. It started with small harassments. Supplies went missing from the edges of camp. Boats were found with holes punched in their hulls. Strange calls echoed through the darkness, mimicking human voices in distress. The brothers were using guerrilla tactics, trying to break down the search party's cohesion and force them to scatter. Sheriff Broussard recognized the strategy and ordered his men to stay together at all costs. No one was to venture away from the main group, no matter what they heard or saw. But fear is a powerful weapon, and the brothers wielded it expertly. The turning point came when one of the search party members, a young deputy named Thomas Guidry, heard what sounded like a woman crying for help. The sound came from just beyond the firelight, close enough to seem within reach. Despite direct orders, Guidry grabbed his rifle and moved toward the sound. He made it perhaps 30 feet before the brothers struck. They emerged from the water itself, covered in mud and vegetation that had made them nearly invisible. The attack was swift and brutal. Guidry managed to fire one shot before being dragged toward the water. His screams alerted the others, who rushed to his aid with torches and weapons blazing. The brothers retreated, but not before the search party got their first clear look at them. They were smaller than expected, wiry and quick rather than imposing. Their faces were gaunt, eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, completely at home in an environment that terrified normal men. Guidry survived the attack, but was badly injured, with deep lacerations and signs of having been partially submerged in the murky water. The message was clear. The Leblanc brothers were no longer content to hide. They were fighting back, defending their territory with savage determination. The hunters had become the hunted, and the advantage had shifted to those who knew every tree, every channel, and every hiding place in this godforsaken wilderness. Sheriff Broussard faced a terrible decision. Continue the hunt and risk more casualties, or retreat and admit defeat to men who had terrorized the region for years. Sheriff Broussard refused to retreat. The discovery of evidence in the brothers' camp had hardened his resolve into something unbreakable. These men had to be stopped no matter the cost. But he also recognized that traditional pursuit tactics wouldn't work. The Leblanc brothers knew the swamp too well, could disappear too easily, and had proven willing to fight with desperate ferocity. The sheriff needed a new strategy, one that turned the brothers' strengths against them. After hours of discussion with his most trusted men, a plan began to form. If they couldn't chase the brothers down, they would make the brothers come to them. The search party began a strategic withdrawal, making it appear as though they were abandoning the hunt. They loaded their boats loudly, complaining about the mission within earshot of the surrounding swamp. They left behind supplies and equipment that would be valuable to anyone living in isolation. Most importantly, they left the camp appearing vulnerable and unguarded. But this was an illusion. 8 men actually remained, hidden in carefully prepared positions around the island. They buried themselves in mud, concealed themselves in hollow logs, and position themselves in the thick vegetation. These were the best woodsmen in the parish, men who could remain motionless for hours and who understood patience as a survival skill. The bait worked better than anyone expected. The brothers returned that very night, drawn by the apparent retreat of their enemies. They approached with extreme caution, circling the camp multiple times before finally moving in to claim the abandoned supplies. The hidden men waited, barely breathing, as the brothers picked through the equipment. The signal to spring the trap came when both brothers were near the center of the camp, far enough from the water that escape would be difficult. Sheriff Broussard fired a shot into the air and the concealed men burst from their hiding places, surrounding the brothers in a tight circle of armed deputies. What happened next became the subject of debate for years afterward. The older brother, a man later identified as Claude Leblanc, immediately surrendered. He dropped to his knees, hands raised, seeming to understand that resistance was futile. But the younger brother, Remy, reacted with animal fury. He fought like a cornered beast, slashing with a crude knife and attempting to break through the circle of men. He managed to wound 2 deputies before being tackled and subdued. The contrast between the brothers was striking. Claude appeared almost relieved to be captured, as if some terrible burden had been lifted. Remy continued to struggle and snarl even after being bound, his eyes wild with rage and something that looked like genuine madness. The deputies fashioned crude cages from salvaged materials and secured both brothers for transport. The journey back to civilization would take 2 days, and no one wanted to risk an escape attempt. As dawn broke over the Delta, the men finally allowed themselves to feel something like triumph. The reign of terror was over. The brothers' arrival in the parish seat caused a sensation. Word had spread about the manhunt and the crimes being investigated. A crowd gathered as the boats arrived, hundreds of people pressing forward to catch a glimpse of the monsters who had haunted the bayou. The reaction was visceral and angry. Several men attempted to rush the prisoners, seeking immediate frontier justice. Sheriff Broussard and his deputies had to form a protective barrier, not out of sympathy for the Leblanc brothers, but out of duty to see that law prevailed over mob violence. The brothers were transferred to the local jail, placed in separate cells, and put under constant guard. The interrogations began immediately. Claude proved surprisingly willing to talk, though his vocabulary was limited and his grasp of normal social concepts nearly non-existent. He had spent his entire life in the swamp, with his brother as his only companion. Their father had taught them trapping and survival skills before drinking himself to death when Claude was 12 and Remy just 10. The boys had continued living in the wilderness, their isolation breeding a worldview that bore little resemblance to civilized morality. To Claude, the women they had taken were simply resources, like the animals they trapped. He showed no understanding of why his actions were wrong, only confusion about why people were angry. Remy remained completely silent throughout his interrogation, refusing to speak or even acknowledge the presence of others. A doctor who examined him declared that years of isolation had left him mentally damaged beyond repair. He had no language skills beyond what his brother had taught him, no understanding of society, and no capacity for empathy or remorse. The doctor's report suggested that Remy had never developed normally, that the isolation of the swamp had prevented his mind from maturing in any meaningful way. He was, in the doctor's words, more wild animal than human being, incapable of rehabilitation or reform. The legal proceedings that followed were brief by necessity. Louisiana in 1899 had harsh justice for violent crimes, particularly those involving women. The evidence from the brothers' camp, combined with Claude's confession, left no doubt about their guilt. The trial lasted 3 days, with testimony from surviving family members of the victims and expert witnesses describing the horror discovered in the Delta. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning guilty verdicts for both brothers. The judge, a stern man named Armand Duclos, showed no mercy. He sentenced both brothers to hang, with the execution scheduled for 2 weeks hence. As the sentence was read, Claude continued to show that same confused acceptance. Remy finally reacted, letting out an inhuman howl that sent chills through everyone present. It was a sound that belonged in the wild places of the world, not in a courtroom among civilized people. The brothers were returned to their cells to await their fate, while the community began the painful process of healing from the nightmare that had unfolded in their midst. The execution took place on a gray September morning, with half the parish in attendance. The gallows had been constructed in the town square, a grim reminder of frontier justice. Claude walked to his death calmly, still seeming not to fully comprehend why this was happening. Remy had to be dragged, fighting and screaming until the very end. The hangman did his work efficiently, and the Leblanc brothers passed from this world as they had lived in it, isolated and incomprehensible to those around them. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves outside the town cemetery, denied even the basic dignity afforded to normal criminals. The community wanted no memorial to their existence, no marker that might become a dark shrine. But erasing their memory proved impossible. The case of the Leblanc brothers became a cautionary tale told throughout the Delta, a reminder of what could happen when isolation and brutality merged in the darkest corners of the wilderness. Parents used their story to keep children from wandering too far into the swamp. River travelers became more cautious about their routes and companions. The very geography of the region seemed tainted, with Dead Cypress Bend gaining a reputation as a cursed place that decent people avoided whenever possible. The island where the brothers had lived was left to rot, slowly being reclaimed by the Bayou that had hidden their crimes for so long. Historians and criminologists would later debate what the case revealed about human nature. Some argued that the brothers were products of their environment, that any children raised in such complete isolation would have developed similar pathologies. Others maintained that true evil existed independent of circumstances, that the brothers had been born with something dark inside them that the swamp merely allowed to flourish. The truth likely lay somewhere between these extremes, an uncomfortable reminder that civilization is a thin veneer that requires constant maintenance to preserve. Remove someone from society completely, deny them education and moral guidance, and the results can be catastrophic. The families of the victims received little closure. In most cases, remains were never recovered from the vast expanse of the Delta. Memorial services were held, prayers were offered, but the swamp kept its secrets. Even today, more than a century later, the story of the Leblanc brothers endures in Louisiana folklore. Modern true crime enthusiasts have attempted to locate the brothers' island, but the shifting nature of the Delta makes this nearly impossible. The channels have changed, new vegetation has grown, and time has erased whatever landmarks might have once existed. The legacy of those dark months in 1899 serves as a reminder that evil can flourish in forgotten places. that monsters can be created when society's watchful eye turns away. The Bayou continues to exist much as it did then, a place of beauty and danger intertwined. And somewhere in its depths, in the spaces between the cypress trees and beneath the dark water, the memory of what happened there lingers like morning fog. If you found this story as chilling as I did, make sure to subscribe for more true crime tales from America's darkest corners. Leave a comment with your thoughts on what drove the Leblanc brothers to their terrible crimes. And check out our video on the Axemen of New Orleans for another disturbing chapter from Louisiana's mysterious past.